Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Boker Tov. My name is Craig Padover, and I am a member of the Adult Education Committee, along with Bob Smolin and Linda Schenker. And it is my pleasure to introduce this morning our guest speaker for this morning's presentation at Temple Israel Talk. We're a little unclear as to whether or not this is being live streamed or taped. We are hoping that that is the case. Apologize if that's not the case, but we'll look into that. But in any event, we're going to try to stay in this area right here. Laurence Fine, son of Rabbi David and Alla Fine, is a junior at Wesleyan University. He recently completed a study abroad program at the University of Havana in Cuba. He had this wonderful opportunity to get an inside look from a local perspective of what Cuba is like. Joe Rosen was sharing with me some of Lawrence's activism as a high school student, and I know he's a fascinating young man, and I'm sure it'll be a great lecture, and we're looking forward to hearing him. I think the way we're going to handle it is, I'm not sure quite how long Laurence will be speaking, but he'll probably want to go through his presentation, and then after, certainly I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and we'll field the questions, and here we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming here. I want to thank my parents for letting me study abroad in Cuba. It wouldn't have happened without for them. They both really wanted me to go to Spain. Unfortunately for them, that did not happen. I went to Cuba instead. In terms of things you might have heard about Cuba, a lot of people ask me, oh, are the cars really that old? Some pictures I took, the cars are like that. It is real. In Cuba, it's cheaper to repair cars than get new cars, and most of the rest of the world is cheaper to get new cars, so that's one thing about Cuba. Talk a little bit about the setup of my program. I was living with a host family in Cuba in a neighborhood right outside Old Havana, not in Old Havana, but right outside, called Bedao. This was me with the host family, as well as one of the other Brown students on my program. I said Brown students because I'm a student at Wesleyan, but this program was administered through Brown University, through a partnership they have with the University of Havana. There's only 13 of us. Over here are all the students in my program. So it's a small program. It's not a very common thing for people to study abroad in Cuba, so there's just 13. There was one other program as well of American students, but other than that, very small amounts of American students in Cuba. In terms of the setup for the classes, we take a mix of classes directly at the University of Havana, as well as some classes at the Brown Program Center. All classes were in Spanish, both at the University of Havana and at the Brown Program Center, and also mixed in with Cuban students at both places, which was very rewarding experience. I have to say my Spanish is a million times better. I came in being able to understand 10% of what was said in a Cuban accent, and by the end I was more or less fluent in Spanish. So it was a very rewarding experience. Cuban Spanish isn't easy. It would have been easier to go to Spain, but I decided to go to Cuba. So I want to talk a little bit about the Jewish community in Cuba. Here is a picture from the synagogue. Cuba has 2 debatable 3 active synagogues, all in the Havana area. This is the Bima. I'm right here. Typically at the end of services for Adon Olam or Aleinu, they would invite all the young people to go on stage. And then one time as well, there was a group of Americans who were visiting the community. They were doing a week-long trip to Cuba. I know there's some members of the congregation who are on similar trips right now. to go visit Jewish sites in Cuba. And whenever that would happen, they would ask me, the community, because I've been going there for several months at some point. I was there for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. I was there for all the holidays, all the way through Hanukkah. And they asked me to go read the Devar Torah in English for the American tourists. So it was a cool way to participate because they knew I had better English than any of them. It was funny when when the American tourists would come, they would read the page numbers, and a lot of times they would say like 16, page 16, but the way they said in their accent, it sounded like 60. So all the Americans would turn to page 60. So for the English, I was a help to the community when they had American tourists. In terms of other things with the Jewish community, something that definitely really helps me put things into perspective in terms of being appreciative of what we have. On the right is the Hanukkah meal for the Jewish community in Cuba. I'm just really puts things into perspective how fortunate we are here at Temple Israel to have really great kiddushes and onegs, and how less resourced other Jewish communities are in other parts of the world. In Cuba, it's difficult to send money to Cuba. It's difficult for them to receive aid. Still, a lot of their resources they get is mostly from Jewish communities outside of Cuba. So, for example, they have a van that was brought here, paid for by some Jewish communities in America to help transport people to services. Twix also, that does not exist in Cuba. Americans brought that here for the Jewish community. Also here you see the Hanukkah gelt that says United States of America. That clearly did not come from Cuba. Other things with the Jewish community, here's a Hanukkah, the Cuban flag. In the basement of the synagogue is the only place in the world where you would see a Cuban flag next to an Israeli flag, which I think was pretty cool. Only place in the world, definitely is not anywhere else. But this is the main synagogue. There's another synagogue in La Habana Vieja, but this is in Old Havana. But this one happened to be a 6-minute walk from my host family, which was more than ideal, by complete coincidence, which was great. In terms of, I thought it would be of interest hearing a bit more about the dialogue, conversation about the Israel-Hamas war in Cuba, and also thoughts about the U.S. in general in Cuba. So I'm a college student, and obviously the dialogue around the Israel-Hamas war, anti-Semitism on college campuses is very strong for Jewish college students. But being in Cuba, it felt a bit more, I think Cubans feel a bit more removed because they feel like this has nothing to do with them, and it has nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, a lot of American college students would feel that the United States is responsible for what's happening. Meanwhile, no one in Cuba thinks Cuba is responsible for what's happening in the Middle East. But I have this picture on the left. This is at the synagogue. It says, El 7 de octubre, más de 240 civiles inocentes fueron secuestrados por el grupo terrorista Hamas. 7th of October, 240 innocent civilians were kidnapped by the terrorist group Hamas. Pictures of all their faces. Help bring them home. Ayudemos a traerlos a casa. It was cool kind of seeing something like this in Cuba. In terms of how, what Cuban people in general are thinking about the war and think about Israel, it's not as divisive as it is in America. Generally, the government in Cuba is very anti-Israel, anti-Zionist by definition. There was, I think, 2 protests in Havana while I was there. One was actually a march to the American embassy in Cuba because they see that by protesting the American embassy is the way that they can feel like they have a voice or an impact in world events and world issues. In terms of most people, though, a lot of Cubans are very skeptical of the Cuban government. So as a result, a lot of Cubans are very, inclined to support Israel because the Cuban government is against Israel, and there's a lot of skepticism towards the government, which is interesting. But generally, it's a bit of an out of sight, out of mind thing for a lot of Cubans. Meanwhile, I felt like, as a Jew, the most anti-Israel people in Cuba were the other brown students on my program rather than Cubans, because you imagine Brown University, a very liberal progressive university, and the type of students who would want to study in Cuba more likely to be communists and people who don't like Israel. To talk a little bit about other parts of Cuba. So I was in Havana, which is all the way in the western part of the country, all the way over here. It's just 90 miles from the Florida Keys, 90 miles from Florida, so it's very, very close. I did a trip out to Pinar del Rio, where there's a lot of beautiful valleys, and we did a trip through the program through to Matanzas, Cienfuegos, as well as all the way to Santiago de Cuba. To give you an idea of how long this island is and how efficient transportation is, to get to Santiago de Cuba, we took a train that was about as fast as New Jersey Transit. So it was very slow. It started off with an 18-hour train from Havana all the way to Holguin, 18 hours, an overnight train. And then when we got to Holguin, another 3-hour bus ride from Holguin to Santiago de Cuba. I liked the train. I thought it was a cool experience more than the other students on the program, being on a long Cuban train. This picture over here is a picture from Santiago de Cuba. It very much is a different country for a lot of differences from the east of Eastern Cuba, Western Cuba. The way they speak Spanish is different. The way they speak Spanish in every single country is different from other countries. But even in Cuba, the way they speak Spanish in Santiago de Cuba sounds a little bit more Puerto Rican or Dominican. Meanwhile, in Havana, it's like their own thing, their own type of Spanish. It was also interesting just living in a place like Cuba for so long, taking classes in Cuba. I remember just, being, growing up in America, being oriented in America, we think like, in terms of America's position in the world, okay, there's Canada, there's Mexico, but in Cuba, my classes are like, okay, here's the US, over here is Mexico, over here is Haiti, over here is Jamaica, and over here is Las Bahamas. So it's interesting to be spending time in another country, taking classes in another country in terms of geography and understanding where Cubans think and feel about, where they are in the world is definitely different. So lots of things are different in Cuba than America. I'm going to try to go through these as I can. Money in Cuba they use dollars as legal tender. They also use euros as legal tender, and they also have the Cuban pesos. If you trade dollars or euros with the government, you're going to get an exchange rate that is half as much as it is from the black market. So if you trade it a dollar with the government, you'll get 90 pesos. If you trade a dollar with someone on the street, you'll get 230 pesos. So I've never traded with the government, only with my host family, Anna, right there. This is Mia, the other brown student in my host family, and as well as Nina, who is actually our Ukrainian grandmother from Kiev, had lived with my host family as Anna's mother. She's originally from Kiev. And that was really cool for me because at the beginning, I know a little bit of Russian from my mom, who is from Odessa, Ukraine. When I was struggling a lot with Spanish, especially at the beginning, when I wouldn't know a word in Spanish, she would try to help me with a word in Russian, and then see because none of them speak English, but she speaks Russian at least, and my Spanish is a lot better than my Russian, but that was a fun mix. She calls it sometimes we'd speak a little mix of Spanish and Russian, and she would call it Ruspanol, which is very fun. Ruspanol is great. So in terms of money, dollars and euros are both legal tender, but they're also the same in Cuba. They're not the same if you convert dollars and euros to pesos, but a lot of time they'll list a price that is in dollars or euros, and there's no, you either pay in dollars or euros, but it's still the same price. But if you change it to pesos, then you can pay in pesos. But it's also you get different exchange rates for pesos all the time, depending on who you trade it with. So if I was trading it with someone I don't know as well, they're going to try to rip me off and give me less pesos for the dollar because they're trying to make money off the exchange. Meanwhile, when I traded money with my host family, that was a lot easier. Not have to. The exchange rates are more generous and more valid. In terms of we'll do questions at the end because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. In terms of ventilation in Cuba, that was a very stark difference. Cuba does not have central air conditioning like there is in the United States. Because of that, almost all buildings, majority of buildings, there are windows open, sometimes permanently. Some rooms would be more closed off, whilst other rooms of the house would be windows permanently open. So for example, bedrooms might be permanently closed off with their own local air conditioning systems. Meanwhile, kitchens, living rooms, other rooms in the house will never have air conditioning. Also, Cuba being a tropical climate, that came with its challenges. And this classroom on the bottom right, classrooms don't have air conditioning in Cuba. Most buildings don't have air conditioning. And in terms of what that meant, in terms of living in places that don't have air conditioning and have open ventilation systems, open windows all the time, obviously lots of bugs, lots of animals. I saw a frog in my room once in Cuba. I didn't know how my room was multiple rooms inside the house. I was like, how did it get there? It's supposed to live like it's supposed to be amphibious. Mia, who's on my left, she told me she saw a lizard in her room. I saw sometimes I would watch cockroaches crawl underneath the door into my room, like this big, like huge, like cockroaches. And also in terms of animals as well, like I go outside at night, I see like these giant snails, like this big, just like everywhere. They're like invasive species. They're all over the place. I'd be eating breakfast. I would see hummingbirds just flying around, and the animals and bugs and everything is very different. At the beginning, I was definitely trying to kill more flies, but at the end, I learned how to just not think about it. In terms of the ventilation quality of buildings, I remember at the beginning there was a time I killed a fly and I hit it against the wall, and I was like, okay, now there's a dead fly on the wall. I got to clean this fly. Take a little tissue. I was like, okay, let me just clean this dead fly off the wall. Paint starts to come off the wall. I was like, no, that's not what I meant to do. But yeah, in terms of the quality of paint in Cuba, it's a lot worse than here. The quality of walls is a lot worse than here. The quality of just construction and building, if you touch the walls, maybe it's the humidity, maybe it's other things, but paint will fall off the walls if you just touch the walls a lot. So if you go to Cuba, don't touch the walls a lot. In terms of other animals, lots of dogs, lots of cats. We had over here with the host family, we had a dog, Bambi. They don't really have dog food in Cuba. My host family told me dog food is super expensive, so we just feed the dog whatever, leftover rice, like the dog will eat anything. The cockroaches that are like running around, like lizards, like the dog chases the lizards, eats the lizards. It's great. And also in terms of like trash collection, trash collection in the rest of Cuba is better than in Havana. Interestingly enough, also internet. Internet's worse in Havana than the rest of Cuba. In terms of trash, lots of dogs and cats, help decompose what people leave behind. In terms of the other themes I have here, so I talked a little bit about internet. Internet in Cuba is a lot worse than in America. In my room, like internet just didn't work. Cell service didn't work. If I ever wanted to talk to my parents, I would walk outside to the back of the house. Then the internet would be a little bit stronger. It would still disconnect all the time. In terms of when I came back to America, I was so not used to how fast the internet was. I was used to having to do things while things loaded, and all of a sudden I was like, wow, this is unusual. In terms of, I had a Cuban SIM card. I had to buy more data all the time. It was an interesting system of how that works. It's certain buildings, there aren't really stores in Cuba, but it's like certain places where you can like ring a doorbell and someone like from the roof of their house like brings down a little string that has like a little card attached to it where you can redeem more data on your phone. So there are no stores for this in general. Water access, electricity. So we had power outages all the time, maybe once a week on average. Really makes us put things in perspective here in America that most of the world, a lot of the world, it is common to have power outages all the time. So in Cuba, we had lamps if it was nighttime. A lot of times it'd just be out for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, and then it'd be back. It wouldn't be a big deal. Sometimes I'd be out of the house when it would happen, and I'd come back, and I wouldn't even realize there was a power outage. It wasn't really too much of an issue. The water outages were worse, more inconvenient than the power outages. Because if I had charge on my phone, I could use a flashlight if I need, or the power outages weren't as much of a big deal than the water outages. Water outages maybe happen on average maybe once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks. And sometimes we had a water outage for 2 or 3 days. So when that happened, we had a device called I don't know what it's called in English. In Spanish, it's called a cubo. And a cubo, you use it to, it's like a water tank. It's like a water reserve. So if you're taking showers, flushing toilets, fill up buckets of water, flush the toilet, or take a shower. My host family, Alla, who's on the left right there with the red hair, she asked me do you want me to go heat up your water before you take a shower, heat up the bucket? And I was like, it's okay. But they did a very good job at making sure us and all the American students were very comfortable while we were there in Cuba. And given that we're not used to things like water outages, power outages, less internet, different ventilation systems. In terms of food in Cuba, so thank God Anna and her family provided me with breakfast and dinner every day, so that made it very easy for me to find food. In terms of kosher food in Cuba, that is not easy. So I was not eating any meat in Cuba because I could only eat kosher meat, and that was hard. There was one other person on the Brown program who was a vegan. She decided to not become a vegan for Cuba because it would be too hard. So she went from limited diet to full diet, and I went from limited diet to more limited diet because in Cuba I was basically eating fish almost every single day. And in terms of the type of fish they have type of foods they have in Cuba, is different. They don't have salmon in Cuba. That's more northern fish. They don't have apples in Cuba. They don't have apple flavored anything. They have other types of fruits that don't exist in America, or do exist in America but aren't common. Things like guayaba, fruta bomba. I don't even really know what all these are called in English, but there's just other fruits and vegetables that don't exist or I don't see in America. And they're great. Lots of plantains in Cuba, rice, beans, fish. That was basically my diet. Also, there's pizza in Cuba. It's not as good as pizza in New Jersey, I have to say. I told some of my Cuban friends that, and they really want to come to New Jersey someday and have some New Jersey pizza. But in terms of how Cubans get their food, most Cubans get their food on the black market because there aren't regular stores. There are no supermarket in Cuba. I've never seen a supermarket in Cuba. There'd be little tiendas that would sell small things. Usually they would sell, the average little tienda would sell beer, wafers, rum, and water, and maybe that would be it, and cigarettes. So not food. There are some small stores that would be maybe the size of right here to the end of this pew, and they would be one aisle, and they would have some things. The reason why there aren't that many stores in Cuba is because the prices are set by the government, and the prices set by the government are too expensive for people to afford. So because of that, the demand for stores is not high, and most people get their food on the black market. And to what means on the black market? Typically on WhatsApp. I know people my age on WhatsApp who sell all sorts of different things. I'm in a group chat in Cuba called Tienda por Todo, store for everything. And the guy just posts like washing machine, refrigerator, rice, like all sorts of different things that would be sold on the black market on these WhatsApp channels. That's how most people get the majority of their food. There are other stores where people get smaller things, but in terms of the Cuban economy, it's very tough. Most things come to Cuba from other countries. The economy is unfortunately very mismanaged, and it's especially in most recent years, and a lot of Cubans leaving Cuba over the last 2 years. I think it's been maybe 200,000, 400,000 who just left Cuba in the last 2 years, 3 years maybe. So it's been a very difficult economic situation for Cubans. I would meet people all the time when I would tell people I'm from America. They would tell me, I would tell someone, oh, I'm going to America, I'm coming home to America in a month. Someone would tell me, oh, I think I'm coming in 6 months. Because my dad came a couple months ago and he loves it. And typically the way most Cubans come to America, there have been times in history where they would take a boat to Florida, to the Florida Keys. It's too dangerous. It's a very dangerous thing to do. Generally, what people have told me, because people telling me this about their family members who have done it already and they want to join them soon. The price for someone to come to America, a Cuban, is $4,000 to $5,000. The way to do that, you can't fly to Mexico because the visa is too complicated and also very expensive. It's I think over $1,000, $2,000 for the visa, because everyone wants to go fly to Mexico to come to America. So instead, what the Cubans do, they fly to Managua, Nicaragua, and then they join up with all of the Venezuelans and Ecuadorians and Colombians and everyone else who's coming through Mexico up to the border. The routes there already exist. It's a free visa for Cubans to fly to Nicaragua. When I went to the airport to come back to America, the gate to Managua, Nicaragua was packed. Every other gate was almost empty, and then everyone going to Managua, Nicaragua. Everyone's trying to go there. They're all coming to America. Generally what they do when they cross the border, then majority still go try to take a bus to Miami, where 2/3 of the Cuban American community is. And typically, they sell their house, sell everything their own, and if they get $4,000 to $5,000, that's enough for one person to go. In terms of other things in Cuba, transportation, roads, I talked a little bit about cars, I talked a little bit about my 18-hour train ride. In terms of the roads in Cuba, the cars are a lot worse in Cuba because of how old they are. Not only that, but the roads are also a lot worse. I'm like, how are they doing this? Sometimes the potholes on the roads would be so big that a car would have to go zigzag, just in the way driving down the road. Or sometimes wait for someone to go around a pothole in the middle of the road, and sometimes it would be unavoidable. And I was in a car and the driver just had to fall in the pothole, just go very slow, stop the car, and then inch, fall in the hole, and then start driving again. And the drivers, they do this like it's normal. They don't know anything different. So it's very impressive. If I learned how to drive in Cuba, I'm sure I would never have any issues with driving ever. One more thing, coffee in Cuba is amazing. It's unlike, I've really learned how to drink coffee in Cuba. I wasn't really a big coffee drinker beforehand. Coffee in Cuba is very dense. After having American coffee when I came back, I was like, oh, this is coffee mixed with water. But this coffee in Cuba is very dense. It's very strong. It's all in shots, very small amounts, and it's the best. It's the best. Go to Cuba, have coffee. And yeah, that's an overview, and we have time for questions.
I have a question about dollars, and you were talking about you would trade on the black market. My question is, how many green dollars did you bring with you? Was that enough? And if you needed more green dollars to trade on the black market, where did you get them?
Good question. So fortunately, I had enough green dollars. For some of the programs, the program that I was with gave us some money for some activities. I think in total I got maybe $200 from the program. In total amount of money I brought was maybe $1,000, $1,200, $1,400 maybe. It was around there. So in total it was, I think I brought more than I needed. I mean, I definitely could have spent less money, and living in Cuba, you don't have to spend that much money at all, especially since my housing was paid for, my breakfast and dinner every day was paid for. So you really don't need that much money. I didn't really need that much money, but in terms of how people would get more money, there's like, I think it might have happened, one of the other students, might have had an issue with this. It's a little complicated. There's some way to like figure out money through some countries or some other banks. There's also, in terms of how to get money, anyone could just fly to Cuba and bring more money. You can just bring as much money as you want to Cuba.
$1,000 in cash.
Yeah.
Where did you keep it? I mean, under the pillow?
A mix of a bunch of different places. I was very secure.
You had it hidden in different spots.
All different spots. I would say I have divided all these different spots. In terms of another thing with money in Cuba is that in America, I can use a debit card, I can use a credit card. Cuba, it's cash only cash. And I think some places, like maybe like European debit or credit card could work, but no American debit or credit card. So when I was going out, let's say I was going out to Santiago de Cuba, I went the week-long trip over there. I had to make sure I had to bring enough cash for the trip, because I don't know how much I was going to spend. In America, it's easy because, if the credit card, A, it's not your money, it's a load. B, or if it's a debit card, it's like, okay, I have a bunch of money on here, I'm not going to run out of money. Meanwhile, in Cuba, I'd be, let's say, going out for the evening, I was like, okay, I need to make sure I have enough money to do everything I want to do, get somewhere, get home, or it's just always having to think about, if I run out of cash, I run out of cash. Like, there's nothing I can do about it. So having to always think about having that physical money on me, that was different. And it's been so great being back in America and using cards, not having to use cash for anything. Yeah.
We are being live streamed, so we'd like you to use the mic, please.
Thank you. So you mentioned that people are skeptical or of the government, in terms of your conversation about the Israel-Hamas U.S. dynamic and what's going on. So this question, it also involves the black market. So it seems that there's a lot of, it's pretty open, like I was surprised to hear that people are openly, quote, against the government, and disagree with, with the government's position on Israel, for example. And it seems as if the economy, this black market economy, is an open secret. That surprises me. I mean, I thought things were pretty, quote, locked down in Cuba.
So in terms of how locked down things are in Cuba, it's yes and no. It's especially among young people. Young people are the most anti the government in Cuba. Most Communist Party members, most people who identify as communists would tend to be older people in Cuba who have nostalgia for before the fall of the Soviet Union. where Cuba was a lot stronger, who have nostalgia for Fidel Castro. But younger people, especially people my age in Cuba, are all like very anti-communist, very pro-U.S. But in terms of the political freedoms, in terms of people being able to talk about these things, people talk about it like I could talk to you anytime, but people also post about similar stuff on social media. But you cannot like hold up a sign, go on the highway, and be like, "I hate the president," because you would get arrested for doing that. So there's some things that would be crossing the line, and there is that line in Cuba where things that are okay and then things that aren't okay. You cannot protest against the government in an actual like protest. The protests I saw in Cuba were organized by the government. So it's a different type of thing. So it is yes. There is those, in terms of things that are online. In terms of the black market, the black market is legal. The government's not trying to say it's illegal for people to sell, between each other. And it's something that, part of it in terms of the government trying to restrict all these things online, it's impossible. It's so much to do, in terms of, it's one thing to restrict, which this business, or you can to restrict, this protest, but to restrict everything that it is being said or being done online, it's out of a lot of people's control. So the government basically says, you can do that on your own. The WhatsApp, selling things, and the country needs it because it's the way the country survives.
Thank you. Just curious, what academic courses did you study in Cuba, and did you find that any of the courses were politicized in any way? And if so, how so?
So that is a great question. Problem with a lot of my courses is that it was hard for me to understand things that would be, it was hard for me to understand a lot because they were all in Spanish. I did understand like most of the courses, but in terms of things that would be like, oh, is that controversial? Oh, is that, like things that would make me think about that, I would doubt whether I understood it correctly because it's in Spanish. So unfortunately, when it's not your first language and you feel like something that's being said is controversial, I would often doubt whether I was understanding it fully. So there were trade-offs with that in terms of like the amount I was able to get out of my classes, because I was struggling a lot with the language, especially at the beginning. Even towards the end, my ability to understand my classes was still a lot worse than my ability to have a conversation with one-on-one conversation with Spanish with someone. I still learn a lot in my classes. I took a class about U.S.-Cuban relations that was taught by a Cuban professor. And that was a seminar in the Brown program with other Cuban students as well. So that was really cool. Nothing that I would nothing too unusual, nothing that I wouldn't expect. Obviously everything is from the Cuban perspective, and I thought that would be important for me to learn from the Cuban perspective. I also took a class at the University of Havana directly there about the history of Cuba. I also took a class, it was a Spanish reinforcement class for people who are already fluent in Spanish, to get better at Spanish and learn more about Cuban Spanish specifically. By complete coincidence, my professor for that class happened to be one of the lay leaders of the Jewish community at the synagogue, which is a complete coincidence because there are only 500 Jews in Cuba, which is a huge coincidence. One of my professors was one of them. But yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Hi, Lawrence. What accounts for the charm of Cuba compared to Puerto Rico or the Bahamas or Dominican Republic?
Yeah, so this picture right here, I took this on my iPhone. Cuba is beautiful. Yes, there's a lot of similarities to a lot of other countries in the Caribbean. Can say one of the beaches I went to in Cuba, the water is light blue. I can see through the water. I'm swimming with the fishes. It's everything you would imagine in the Caribbean. Cuba has tourism, but not as much tourism from Americans than a lot of these other countries like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. A lot of the tourism in Cuba is from Europeans. And also other countries in Latin America as well. I met tourists from Russia. Russians love to go to Cuba because of the shared history that they have. So that's also in terms of other things with like Russians in Cuba. Definitely like a lot of more Russian speakers in Cuba. It's interesting how like in America, like people who don't know Spanish would know like hola, ¿cómo estás? Like most Americans know what that means, even though most Americans don't know Spanish. But in Cuba, like everyone knows like как дела, хорошо. Like everyone knows does the equivalent in Russian, which I thought was really interesting. But in terms of the charm of Cuba, I was talking a little bit about how Eastern Cuba is a bit more Caribbean, and how a bit more like Dominican in terms of the way they speak. It's a bit more like Dominican or Puerto Rican, but Western Cuba is like its own thing, and that's something that I kind of valued a lot. I didn't necessarily know that going to Cuba, and I think Cuba is very unique in a lot of ways. I mean, Cuba is bigger than all of these other countries in terms of size. Also, Havana is the biggest city in the Caribbean. So that was part of the reason why I wanted to go study in Havana in terms of understanding history of the Caribbean. Havana is the biggest city; it's around 2 million people. In terms of what makes Cuba a very unique place as well, a lot of other countries that are poor tend to be spiraling with population, have a bunch of little kids. Cuba is not like that at all. Cuba is like, you see very few kids. Like people do not want to have kids in Cuba. You don't see little kids, there are young people, but it's Cuba has a declining population, which is interesting in terms of the demographics. Usually, in terms of countries with declining populations, we hear about like super developed countries like Japan or other countries that would have just low fertility rates, and then skew to being a lot of more older people in the society. But Cuba, interestingly, matches that as well because of how difficult the economy is, and also everyone trying to leave the country, especially in recent years. There's been a series of different waves of Cubans coming to America. In terms of other things of the Cuban charm, this picture in the center over here, that's at the Vinales Valley, all the way in western Cuba, in the most westernmost province, Pinar del Rio. This over here on the left side, these are some musicians in Santiago de Cuba, all the way the complete opposite part of the country, over 18 hours away. And over here is me in Havana. I think given Cuba's history and its stage of development, it is just a very unique place to be. Cuban people are awesome, very friendly, very fun, very exciting. I took a Cuban salsa class in Cuba as well. It was hard. Apparently all Cubans know how to dance salsa because they start teaching that to them when they're 5 years old in elementary school. In elementary schools in America, they don't do that. But that's why everyone in Cuba knows how to dance, is because they do it from that age. But I really enjoyed Cuba. I've met really awesome people there. I've had a really great time. And they do have enough infrastructure to support tourism. They have hotels, they have clubs, they have bars, they have all sorts of things, beaches. They have beautiful nature, beautiful green spaces. One Cuban told me that Cuba is Havana, and then there's all of this green space, and then Santiago de Cuba is this other country. It's a huge country. There's a lot of diversity within the country. I'd say something else too with Cuba is a lot of Americans assume that that Cuba is a white country because most of the Cubans in America are white, but it's very much not true. Most Cubans are not white at all. There's a lot of history in Cuba with the slave trade, and also, indigenous peoples in Cuba as well. Most people in Cuba are not white, but most Cuban Americans are white. So it's why a lot of Americans would think that Cuba is, more of a white country than Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic. Maybe it slightly is, but it's definitely America's a lot more of a white country than Cuba. That's for sure.
We're going to take a few more questions. Excuse me. I can't recall who had their hand up first.
Somebody else probably. But regarding entertainment, were you guided to or from stuff? You might have been, allowed to go to some places where tourists typically go. Americans might be, Canadians might go to a certain place. Were you kind of pushed away from or not allowed to go to places where the common Cuban people might go for entertainment, music, something like that?
I can go wherever. That's the other question.
Okay.
I have freedom to go wherever. That's great.
In the U.S., we get our news and information through printed media and televised media and internet media, and I'm wondering what that's like in Cuba specifically. Is it limited or censored at all?
Printed media and TV is very censored. But I also was talking about how the young people would be the most anti-communist, the most anti the regime. It's also partly because they use social media so much, and social media the government does not regulate. They do regulate, newspapers and TV, but not social media, and because of that is why there's a lot more anti-government sentiments among younger people.
I have a question to ask you about the Cuban people in general when you were there. When you met people that were Cuban born and you talked to them on the train and in other places other than university, when they found out that you were an American, what was the reaction to you coming there as an American? And could you let the audience know about some of the other cities that you visited when you had some free time, other than being in Havana, what it was like seeing some of the sites or museums, and how was the reaction of people meeting you as an American? Thank you. Thank you for your program.
Of course, thank you. It's a great question. In terms of people's reactions, I would love to play this game because people obviously can tell I'm not Cuban. So they would, ask me where I'm from, and I would say, ¿Qué crees? What do you think? What do you think about where I'm from? ¿Qué crees sobre mi país? So a lot of times it'd be Alemania, Germany, France, England, Austria, Poland, Russia? I was like, Estados Unidos, America. They're like, oh. That they would expect there's so few Americans, and there are way more tourists from all of these other European countries. One time, I was a taxi driver having a conversation, and my Spanish was like really good in this conversation. Like I was understanding everything, I was speaking great. He asked me where I'm from because I'm obviously not Cuban. He knows that. And he guessed I was from Ecuador, and I'll always remember that because I was, he thought I was from Ecuador. He thought Spanish was my first. That was cool. But in terms of how people think about America and me being from America, young people think it's cool. Young people, they all want to go to America. They're like, oh, I told you that one person is like, oh, I think I'm going in 6 months. Maybe we'll meet in America someday. In terms of generally, it's my nationality. People did not really hold it so much against me in Cuba. Originally, I was more concerned about that at the beginning, going there and telling people that I'm American. But the more time been there, the more comfortable I felt with being an American and telling people I'm an American, because most people are against the government. But even government people, they understand that it's important for the U.S. and Cuba to have a relationship. Generally, they want the U.S. to end the blockade on Cuba. The government blames all of the problems internally in Cuba on the U.S. blockade. Sure, that I believe that contributes to some of the problems, but that's obviously not the root of all of the problems. And a lot of the young people in Cuba see that as well. Older people who would tend to be Communist Party members, and people who identify as communists, they would say that, oh no, all the problems are just because of the blockade. If you end the blockade, then everything will be fixed, and that's not true given all the other mismanagement in the economy and the government. But I think if you end the blockade, forces the government to it forces the government to be accountable for problems in Cuba, which I think could change things. But also in Cuba, there isn't the idea of trying to change things or the government. People who don't like communism are not trying to make Cuba a capitalist country. They're trying to come to America. So that's basically the perspective. In terms of other parts of Cuba, in terms of the differences between people I've met in other parts of Cuba, the vast majority of my time was in Havana. I'd say there very much is this national identity. I don't think the differences are too stark between Eastern Cuba, Western Cuba. Yes, their accent is different, but it still very much felt like Cuba. And even so, there's I met people in Havana who were from other provinces originally. People in Havana who are from Eastern Cuba. It's still very much, I don't necessarily agree with, that person who told me that Cuba is Havana, green space, and then some other country in the East. And a lot of people wouldn't agree with that, but I thought it was funny.
Thank you for talking this morning, Laurence. Very interesting. I have more questions about your program itself. How many students were on the program? Were there any other Jewish students other than yourself? Was it like a consortium of, you mentioned, Brown, and how many universities were involved? And the final question is, were there organized social activities through the program, or did you do things on your own? And if you did, was there a safety factor? Did you always have a buddy? Did you always go with a group of friends or people to not travel alone? What was the crime? Was there crime, and were you worried about it at all? So.
Yeah, so I never went to another province on my own. That was a rule. Don't go to another province in Cuba on my own. I did go with other people in the program. We do, trips, groups of 2, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. In total, the program was 13 people. Interestingly enough, the program included 2 students from Brazil and 1 from Honduras, but they were all students in America. There were 3 Brown students, 3 Wesleyan students, 3 Dartmouth students. I think 1 Colby, 1's Johns Hopkins, 2 Swarthmore. I think that might have been the mix. And so yeah, small program, just 13 of us. We had that center, which included Wi-Fi, which was great because Wi-Fi, we didn't have Wi-Fi at my host family. And it was also, in terms of internet stuff too, just to say, there were times that we lost Wi-Fi for a week, and they couldn't fix it, and they're getting these people to cut, and just something that just happened, and we have I'm supposed to access my readings online for my classes, but there's no Wi-Fi. So should I try to do it from my phone? But the login's a little weird, but the cell service works so slowly on the phone. Is it even going to work? in terms of getting Wi-Fi, I'd go to this hotel all the time. I'd pay for the hotel Wi-Fi, and I'd just relax, and I'd like, download Netflix or like, these things like, like comfort stuff. So I'd just go to the hotel, pay like my 250 pesos, get 2 hours of Wi-Fi, and I was just like, oh, this is great. So in terms of Wi-Fi, I would do that. But in terms of, those questions about the program, it's, in terms of support staff, they had maybe like 2 main support staff, and then like, the professors were affiliated with the program as well, and then they had like a receptionist, and it was through this organization called Casa de las Americas, which is this educational center focusing on the arts, and in Havana, and part of the Casa de las Americas is this program with Brown for these 13 American students, and I think it was 15 for this following semester. I did meet the American students on this other program as well in Cuba. They didn't have the same type of, I think they didn't have the same type of resources that we had in terms of having that Wi-Fi center, in terms of having some of these organized trips for us, going to Santiago de Cuba, because that's something I definitely like. That would have been hard to do on my own, figuring out the 18-hour train and then getting from like Holguin to Santiago. Apparently there would have been a train that was like going to go straight to Santiago, but it just would have been like, the conditions would have been worse, so they decided to put us on the nicer train, which of course included like, cockroaches like on the walls like overnight, and just like, at the beginning it was like everyone on the group was like scared, oh, the cockroaches on the wall, on the floor, and they're running around the train, and we were on the nice section of the train. I don't know what the other section normal section looks like. But, it was, over time, we just got used to it. It's fine. Like, the cockroaches aren't out for us. Like, it'll be fine. They aren't as big as the ones in I would see in Havana all the time, the ones this big. They're like smaller ones, but yeah.
Okay, we're all good? Okay, we're going to take a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Hi, amazing. Could you speak a moment about the Jewish community? You mentioned that there are only 500 of them, and also that the population is dwindling and people aren't having children. Does that include the Jewish people not having children? And what do you think is the future of those 500 and maybe even diminishing population of Jews?
So there used to be a lot more Jews in Cuba. Following the Cuban Revolution, I think it's like 94% of the Jews in Cuba left to America. So this is the 6% that stayed. A lot of them, I remember some of them talking about how like, older people tell me how their like grandparents like founded the synagogue like all these years ago. In terms of the Jewish community, it's mix between Ashkenazim, Sephardim. A lot of them are descendants of Jews that came from Turkey to Cuba in the early 20th century during the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the years preceding that. A lot of them, there are also Jews that came, escaping Europe at around the time of the Holocaust, descendants of those Jews. In terms of the size of the Jewish community, in terms of people not having children, people do have children, but compared to other countries of similar wealth, in a lot of other poorer countries, people would have like 5 children, or they would be. In Cuba, it resembles more of like, in terms of their demographics, more similar to a more overdeveloped country where, the economy's so hard, people are waiting until they're like in their 35 to have their first kid, because of how difficult it is to live in Cuba. Also because they have very strong access to birth control in Cuba. Meanwhile, a lot of the other countries of similar wealth do not have that type of strong access to birth control. They have, strong sex education and education in general in Cuba, because in terms of education, it's different. Like, you do, in terms of, there are a lot of differences in education in Cuba, so that would be another question. But in terms of the size of the Jewish community, it is small. But as in this picture over here, they frequently involve young people in the services. They invite all the young people to go for the end of the service. The services are led by like 1 or 2 lay leaders plus like a rotation of different young people as part of their idea to help pass on the traditions, the customs to young people. In terms of some of their prayers, a little different. Something I love the most about what they do, the Lajado D is a little different. They do like, after the main Lajado D line, they add like a line in Spanish, which I thought was really cool. They also, as you can see, our arms are all around each other. It's a very common thing in services. I've heard apparently in a lot of Jewish communities in Latin America have our arms around each other and always like sway side to side during all sorts of different songs, which I thought was interesting. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take, I guess, one more question here. Okay. All right. 2 more questions.
What was your experience with healthcare and then government officials and the government kind of in general, police enforcement when you were in Cuba?
So at the beginning, they gave us a tour of this international or this health clinic that if we had problems, we would go to. It's not the health clinic that regular Cubans would go to. It was like a higher end one for like very important people. That's where they would send, Americans or tourists if anything happened. I actually have this picture at the beginning. So this is this doctor over here. And this is the very beginning of the time in Cuba. It was one of the first places we went to is to go see the health clinic in case we had any issues, so we get a little bit of comfort, like what it is and if there's any problems. And then during the tour, this guy was talking about how he like made the Cuban vaccine for COVID. And we're like, huh? Like this is like, this guy's like Fauci in Cuba, and then it was just like so like low key, like it wasn't like it wasn't a big deal. Like he just brought it up very casually. It's like, yeah, like when I worked on the vaccine and for the COVID, and I was like, wow. And that's the guy who made the vaccine. We didn't even know who he was at the time of this picture. Given Cuba's isolation and the blockade, they do a lot of their health stuff on their own. Health education in Cuba, people studying to become doctors, is typically a lot better than a lot of other places in the world, in Latin America. When I tell people that I'm American, a lot of them are an American student here in Cuba, then they would ask me, oh, are you studying medicine? Because they know medicine is good in Cuba, so like, why else would I be in Cuba? I was like, no, I'm studying government. They're like, you're studying government? They're like, no, don't study government here. People have told me that. They're like, no, it's okay. I support you. Like, so that's what a lot of like young Cubans like. That's a conversation I've had with multiple people. But I fortunately never got sick in Cuba, so thank God for that. Other people in my program got sick. Maybe part of the reason why I didn't get sick is because I wasn't eating meat in Cuba, so maybe that helped. But I fortunately did not have to deal with the health system in Cuba. In terms of that I think that answers the question.
Last question from Rabbi Fine. Excuse me.
So you mentioned that you went to Cuba even though your parents wanted you to go to Spain. And you mentioned that most of your expenses were paid for, right? So how do you, this experience, where will you go from here? What do you see as this affecting your trajectory, and was it worth it?
Spoken like a real father.
Definitely worth it. Going to Cuba isn't easy. It's definitely going to Spain would have been easier in terms of all the different challenges, but very rewarding experience. One of the other students on my program actually studied in Spain the prior semester, and she told me that Cubans were more friendlier than Spaniards because they're like, Spain is like, oh, some American, like, oh, whatever. Like, they see Americans all the time. They think Americans are annoying. And Cuba, it's like, whoa, American. I've never seen an American before. I've heard so much about America. I've seen all these movies. I want to come here in 6 months. So, it was cool to be an American in Cuba. In terms of where I'm going from here, I am very excited to, this next semester I am taking the semester off because I'm ahead with credits at Wesleyan, and I'm going to be working at the State Department in DC in the Office of Cuban Affairs, which is really fitting, and I'm very excited about that. I couldn't think of a more ideal opportunity to build upon my semester in Cuba by working in Cuban affairs in the U.S.-Cuba relations, especially taking classes on that in Cuba. So I'm very excited about that. And then after that, I'll be returning to Wesleyan in next fall for my final year of college. And yeah.
What an absolutely fascinating hour. It flew by, huh? So thank you so much, Laurence. It was really terrific. I think all of us really appreciated your perspective, being a local product and having so much insight and being a young person and could relate to so much of what's going on right now. So I also want to thank Dave Millman for putting up this display here and allowing us to see the PowerPoint, and this is being live streamed, which is terrific. We're not sure if it's being recorded, but it is being live streamed. So I just want to quickly, on behalf of the Temple Israel Adult Education Committee, go over what's on the agenda after this terrific launch here for 2024. Rabbi Fine is going to start his lecture series beginning next Sunday at 9:30 on Hannah Arendt, famous Jewish philosopher who coined the phrase banality of evil about Adolf Eichmann. And Rabbi Fine's lectures, there's essentially one every month. There's at least one every month, 2 in March and 2 in June. So it starts next Sunday at 9:30 and continues till June 16th, a total of 8 lectures about Hannah Arendt. We hope you can make it. Those will also be live streamed. Then on February 22nd, our very own Professor Alan Sanders, that is Thursday, February 22nd at 8 o'clock. He will be giving an interesting lecture called The 2024 Political Landscape, Navigating Rapids. By then, February 22nd, we will, I guess, be marching towards an election, so I'm sure by then it should be especially fascinating to hear Professor Sanders' observations about where things are at. So that's Thursday, February 22nd at 8 o'clock. And then we have, through the Education Committee, also have Rabbi Leah's weekly programs on Tuesday nights at 7:30, looking at some of the iconic rabbis from the past 1,000 years, beginning in 70 CE. And then Thursday afternoon, she has lectures about Kabbalah. So that is essentially it. And Joe Rosen would like to say something as well.
Sure. This coming Friday night, there's a membership Shabbat dinner at 6 p.m., followed by a Bima Band during services at 7 and Oneg at 8. If you'd like to come to the dinner, I'm going to stand at the door and I'll take your RSVPs, please.
So thanks again, and could we get one more round of applause for this outstanding young man? Great. Thank you. Thank you all for attending.